everyone, and thank you so much for joining. And thank you to Ashlyn for the lovely introduction. As Ashlyn mentioned, my name is Julia Gutgsell, and I conducted research looking at shunning, specifically in Jehovah's Witnesses, as part of my Master's of Science in Criminology. This was now a few years ago, so it was the dissertation was submitted in 2017. I hope this presentation today is going to be really interesting to people. I know that often academic presentations can be very boring and dry, so I'm hoping to keep this really interesting, and I also hope that for people who perhaps have personal experience, either themselves or by proxy through friends or family, that they might take something away that can be helpful to them. I do want to say as well, just before I go into any of the content, if you do feel uncomfortable at any point during the presentation, please feel free to switch it off. Some of the content might be upsetting for some people, so please do not feel like you have to stay here and listen for the whole thing. It can also be helpful, if you do have personal experience, to watch it with someone else, so that you're not on your own when you watch it. So yeah, just as Ashlyn mentioned, I completed this. I will be sharing the findings, well, some of the findings of our research with you. For those of you who are really interested, you can also read the full dissertation online. But I think this covers the core findings really well. So just to give a little bit of background in terms of who I am and why I'm coming to this topic. So I think my interest in totalitarianism and totalitarian organizations started at a really, really young age. I grew up in South Tyrol, which is in the very northern part of Italy, and my region was impacted by both Italian fascism and German National Socialism. So I think these were always topics that were really close and they're really alive when I grew up. I remember, learning lots about it in school. I remember visiting a concentration camp when I was far too young, I think. So it was definitely something that was very much alive when I grew up. I can even remember, probably before going to school, it was something I was very familiar with to a level, I think. I was also raised Catholic, so that's kind of my religious background, although I'm no longer practicing or involved with the church. So some people might consider me a lapsed Catholic or a cultural Catholic. I then went on to study criminology. I did a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Science. I don't think I consciously chose that area due to my upbringing or due to kind of my interest in this area. I think it was just something I kind of fell into, and continuing kind of that theme that I grew up around, I think made a lot of sense for me at that stage. So as I mentioned, my dissertation was finished in 2017, and I've since also co-authored a paper that was submitted as evidence to IICSA, which is the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse in England and Wales. And the inquiry was specifically looking, as well as some of the religious organizations and institutions where child sexual abuse has been an issue historically or more recently. And you can find the paper online, so either on the IICSA website or on my own academia page. I will share the academia page at the very end of the presentation for those who are interested. Since I've graduated, I would consider myself more a practitioner. So I've been working with different projects and different communities, different groups. Some of them are labeled hard to reach communities, and some of the communities that I've worked in have been with young people offenders, homelessness, domestic abuse, and I've also worked with the Scottish Prison Service for a little bit. And I think the thread probably for all these communities and groups that I've worked with is really trauma. Trauma is something that is, and especially early childhood trauma, is something that's very present in all of these settings. Before I go into the actual presentation, I'll give an overview of what it is that I'm looking specifically at in this presentation. And just to let you know as well, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'll very happily answer them at the end. So before I give an overview, I just want to be very clear. I'm not specifically going to talk about what cults are or how we recognize them. I think there's a lot of really great presentation on the IICSA website and papers that you can read. So I think there is, I suppose, a level of pre-knowledge that the presentation perhaps requires. I don't necessarily think, I think you can watch the presentation without that knowledge, but it's just something to bear in mind that is not something I'm going to go into much detail. So what I'll be sharing in the presentation is going to be the theoretical background to ostracism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the broader research around ostracism, what do we know about ostracism, and then I'll specifically look at Jehovah's Witnesses and how the organizations, how the policies talk about ostracism, and how shunned members and how shunned Jehovah's Witnesses are treated. I'll also share a little bit about the methodology. I will keep that very brief though, because I know that it's not something that people are generally very interested in, and it can be a bit dry. So I'll try and keep that short, but I wanted to have it in there for those who are interested. And then I will go into the main research findings, and we'll have some questions before we go to the questions. I'll share just some key takeaways that are basically a very brief summary of what we'll be looking at. So in terms of the research context and relevance, I had an interest in Jehovah's Witnesses from a really early age. I think it was probably 4 or 5 when Jehovah's Witnesses came to my childhood home, and I was allowed to open the door because I grew up in rural Italy, and so it was very common for children being allowed to open the door. And I remember opening the door, and these 2 women stood there, and they were kind of asking, is there an adult at home, kind of thing. And at that moment, my grandmother came down the stairs, and she saw them, and she just closed the door and told me to never open again if I see those people with the magazines, because that showed me the magazine. And I tried to ask questions, but I was kind of just shut down. It wasn't really explained to me why I shouldn't open the door. And I think I had this moment of like stranger danger, and it was just a bit strange because I remember thinking, oh, they looked so nice, they looked so lovely, like why should I not be talking to them? And so I think it just had this really big impact. And I really vividly remember this memory, and I don't have a lot of memories from that age. So it's just really interesting how that has shaped a lot of that interest for me. I then had key moments of exposure to JWs throughout my childhood and teenage years and early adulthood. This was mainly, once I moved to the city, and I saw them at train stations, and I did actually, at some stage I did start to engage in conversations. I started reading their literature, not really because I was interested in becoming a part of Jehovah's Witnesses, but just more because I was still kind of fueled by that encounter in my, when I was 4 or 5 years old. I just wanted to know more about them and understand. And then when I was in university, I actually heard about Shunning from a former Jehovah's Witness who told me that he was shunned. And so I then also started doing some preliminary reading because my dissertation was coming up, and I knew I had to choose a topic. So I then the other context is, this research is very much embedded in the wider context of ostracism. So ostracism has been studied primarily in kind of laboratory conditions, looking at the very short-term impact. So for example, there is an experiment which is called the cyber ball, and it's basically a ball tossing game that's played online, and your ball is being tossed by a computer usually, and all of a sudden the ball is not tossed at the research subject anymore, and so that research subject is virtually ostracized from that ball tossing game. And it's actually been it's based on the professor who designed this experiment. He actually experienced this in real life, and he then used that experience and turned it into an experiment. So it's very much done in laboratory conditions because ethically it's not something you can do as a researcher. You cannot expose research, you cannot subject to long-term exposure. So we don't actually know that much about what it's like for people and what happens to people who have been exposed for very, very long periods of ostracism or shunning. So this was something that then got me more and more interested because I saw this gap in research. And I also thought that it was very practically relevant because people are experiencing this, and it's not something that is unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. So again, I'm not going to go into lots of detail about cults, but shunning is definitely one of the core features that's very common to these groups, because by shunning they create isolation, they create a really insular community that doesn't have a lot of impact, or sometimes none, completely no impact, completely shut off from the outside world. So it's something that a lot of people do experience. And we also will see in a minute, shunning is something that most of us have already experienced. So even if we've never been part of an ethical group of any kind, we'll probably have experience with it in one-to-one relationships or other areas. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. In terms of criminological relevance, some people sometimes ask me, what does this have to do with criminology? And so I've just put some key terms there. So we're looking at things like recursive control, the ethical or unethical conduct of organizations, and where the line lies. When does conduct become unethical? We talk about parental rights. How far are parents allowed to subject us to certain things, and when do statutory services need to become involved and intervene? And especially, I think that is especially relevant here because my research is looking very specifically at Jehovah's Witness children who are born in and whose parents already were members often when they were born, or became members when they were very, very small. So one of the criteria that I developed for this research was that I asked people if they had any memories of the time before their parents were Jehovah's Witness, and if they had a memory before then, I excluded them because I really wanted to focus what it's like for people born in, because I think there is a difference. We do see that there's a difference when people are raised in those environments and don't have any other experience that they can relate to. So yeah, then at the end, there's just a reminder again, if you do have any personal experience of shunning and you're feeling uncomfortable, please feel free to do whatever feels right for you. Obviously, if I was doing this in person and I would see reactions, I'd be there to support you, but I'm not. So please do look after yourself and do what feels right for you. If you can watch it with someone, please watch it with someone else, or watch it when you're feeling ready to watch. So this is just to give you a bit of background in terms of ostracism. So ostracism has actually, it's really interesting looking at the research, because it's not something that's unique to human relationships. It's something we find, for example, in the animal kingdom. So it's something that is used for animals to manage resources, to make the group stronger, so to eliminate weak animals within the group that might pose a threat when, from predators. So it's something that we might consider is a natural behavior to a degree. What ostracism is, it's being excluded or ignored, and it's often defined as a social mechanism to enforce conformity. So that's kind of what we would see it in human relationships, especially, is that it's really there to enforce conformity, cohesion of a group. It's also very interesting when we look in terms of our language. I would be really interested if, if English is not your native language, as you can probably hear, it's not mine either. So, if you have any other words that I haven't mentioned there, please, let me know, reach out. I'm always really interested in how we describe this form of behavior. So I've put a couple there. So there's the silent treatment, which is very often used in romantic relationships. So if your partner kind of, gives you the silent treatment or shows you the cold shoulder. Shunning, timeout. Timeout is often used with children, for example, in school, or if we send them to their room. Silencing, I think that is specifically used in the military. Banishment, cancelling or cancel culture. ghosting. We also have other words like sending someone to Coventry is quite commonly used. There's a couple more, but I think that that will give you kind of a flair of how many words we actually have and how pervasive that behavior is as well, because generally the more words we have to describe something often gives an indication of how pervasive a behavior is. And there is, in research shows that there's probably actually a way that our brain has developed to detect ostracism. Because ostracism, it's often also called, actually that's another word that I have mentioned there, is social death. That's, and often, especially in primitive society, it would have been, if you were banished or shunned from your group, it would have meant physical death very often, because you were cut off from resources, from the group's protection. So because it has that extreme consequence, very much often very much life and death, our brains have actually developed, or it's thought that they've developed, to have a very early detection system. So because that allows us, the earlier we can detect ostracism, the quicker we can respond and try to potentially repair a relationship that's been harmed in some way. So by us being able to detect it so quickly, we can respond actively to that. And fMRI studies, so studies looking at the brain, have found that it overlaps our physical brain region. So it's the same brain region that gets activated during physical pain that's activated during ostracism. So that's some really kind of interesting findings there. And there's also some other findings are that what ostracism does, it poses a threat to four fundamental needs, which are belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence. So when we look at that, when people feel like they don't belong, they're very low self-esteem, they feel like they have no control over their lives and their lives is lacking in meaning or purpose, we can kind of see how that would really wear someone down, especially when it's being done on a period of weeks, months, for many people who are shunned as part of cults, in fact many years or even decades. Some of the people that I've interviewed have experienced it for decades, so it's a really long time to experience those threats and be ostracized for that period of time. So I'll share with you a model that's been developed, and it's called the 3 stages of ostracism. And it was originally designed in 1997 and then revised in 2005. And what I will say is that I'll go through the model and just explain the way it's set up at the different stages. I would add that I think there are potentially more stages, and it is what the author, like Kipling Williams, who developed it, he himself said it's a working model and it's something that should be revised, should be looked at, and so it is a working model that we need to work with. So the first stage would be the reflexive responsive stage, and that is, as the word suggests, reflexive. So it's really something that people experience almost automatically. So it's not something that we really have control over, and people do tend to experience it quite similarly across the board. The second stage is the reflective response stage, and that is when people actually take a step back and they're able to reflect on it and reflect on what's going on. They might reflect on who's doing the shunning, so who is the person doing it, why are they doing it. It might also be moderated by individual differences. So some of them might be age, gender, whether you have any other kind of mental health problems, maybe social anxiety or depression, self-esteem. Those things might impact how people experience and how they weigh ostracism. And at the second stage, so the second stage is also where we would employ our coping mechanisms. So that is when we're trying to fortify those needs that are being either threatened or that we've lost. So generally there are 2 main behaviors or coping mechanisms that have been looked at. One of them is pro-social behavior, and that would be, pro-social behavior would be mainly if people are trying to regain that relationship, or they try to re-enter that group, and they want to be a part of it. They try to act very social, so the group will accept them again. And it's also more likely if the identity is fused with the group, which is very likely in cults, that the identity is very much enmeshed with the group, especially for those who are born in. They may feel like they don't have anything outside of the group, and they're nobody outside of the group. If the person feels like they can't re-enter the group, they might become more aggressive, and they might try just to get a reaction, or provoke a reaction, because when they're being shunned, they're getting no reaction. So any kind of reaction, even if it's a negative reaction, might make them feel like they're in control and they have some kind of meaningful existence. And the third response that's been less studied is social withdrawal and social avoidant behaviors. So some people might start to not try to engage with relationships anymore. They might be very worried about how other people are going to react and respond to them. And it's a really physical or psychological withdrawal from relationships. So it's also important to mention at this point that ostracism is the extreme of ostracism is that very physical withdrawal where you don't exist anymore for people. So it's very much, it's almost as if you were dead, even though you're still very much alive. So it's really feeling like you're a ghost and other people around you just ignore you and you're not part of anything. So it can be on a spectrum as well. So it can range from people shunning and ostracizing you when you're in the room with them, but it can also be a very much a physical isolation where you don't see anyone anymore and you're completely on your own. The second stage, which the reflective responsive stage, that's really where we're trying to resolve that conflict. So we're either trying to regain membership in a group or in a relationship, or we're trying to get some kind of reaction to kind of reinforce our need for control, or reinforce our understanding that we do exist. And because if we provoke a reaction in the other person, that kind of shows to us, well, they do know I exist. The third stage, which is the long-term stage, this is when someone has been ostracized perhaps for many weeks, months, years, sometimes, as I mentioned, decades. And the resignation stage is really kind of that stage where people are just resigned to their condition, to being shunned, and they might feel like there's nothing they can do anymore to be part of a relationship. And often they can't cope anymore. They really struggle to cope with that situation, and they might feel hopeless, depressed. And it's characterized as that really last stage when all attempts to reconnection have failed. I personally think that this model can be quite negative. I think especially when I first heard it, it kind of felt very kind of black and white, like you either regain the relationship or you don't, and then you're resigned to that. I do think that there perhaps are other stages, and I have specifically in recent months, and this will not be in the dissertation, so if you're interested, it's something you can maybe read up elsewhere online, is the stages of grief, and it's a model by Kübler-Ross and Kessler. Kessler has done some follow-on work, and basically it looks at how people deal with grief and bereavement. So they very much look at, well, most of their work looks at the physical bereavement, so really someone dying and how people deal with that. However, it's now being applied to many other situations, and so it really looks at loss in a broader sense. And I think that model, as I will explain further on in the presentation, does actually, I think, has a more positive and a more positive meaning around it, but also one that's more empowering because it actually gives people steps almost, or insights on how they might be able to progress. So just to point out as well, ostracism in a religious context is something I think has some very unique elements to it. Because of that religious element, people might feel like they're losing part of their spirituality, of their religion. They might have a changed relationship with God if they still believe in God. They might struggle to know whether certain practices, whether they can still practice them, whether their values are still the same. So they might have lots of questions in terms of what is the meaning of life, for example. You know, is there an afterlife? Am I going to be, is there going to be salvation for me? There's a lot of very specific experience that people might have who are shunned, because they are really cut off from that religious environment, from that religious meaning framework. So now that we've looked at specifically at the framework for and the broader research around shunning, I want to apply it to the Jehovah's Witnesses. So in the first paragraph, I've just kind of outlined that the Jehovah's Witnesses have not always been excommunicating members, and it's actually a practice that they've heavily criticized in the past, where they have called excommunication as being altogether foreign to Bible teachings, and they've even called it a weapon for clergy to attain a combination of power and control. And so it's interesting reading the view that they used to have in 1947, and then looking at how they're treating members now and how they're using shunning. Disfellowshipping, so disfellowshipping is their word for excommunication, was introduced in 1952, and they're saying that they've introduced it as a consequence of moral corruption after World War II. I'm not going to go into too much detail into the next paragraphs, but I've just listed a number of offences requiring review by elders, and that is, I'm putting it in quotes because that's what they call it, so offences that if they were brought to the attention of the elders, they would require review, and they may lead to a judicial committee, which is a judicial committee is where the elders would meet to then establish whether this offence has happened, and they would also establish whether the person is genuinely repentant. If the sin or offence has been established, and the person is not found to be genuinely repentant, they may then be disfellowshipped. And a person that's disfellowshipped would be announced at the congregation. So the whole congregation would know that this person is now disfellowshipped, and I think they usually say that they should be viewed as such, which then implies that they should no longer interact with the disfellowshipped member. And that's very physical, so it's completely cutting off all ties. When we look at ostracism, and you can read more about that if you read some of the ostracism literature, there's different motives behind ostracism, and in this context for Jehovah's Witnesses, I would say that it's a very punitive motive. So it's condemning unwanted behaviors and correct unwanted behaviors, and it's punishing people for something they've done, controlling them. Just as a side note as well, for those who are not very familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses, there's also a way that people can voluntarily leave the group, which is called disassociate. However, there are some offences that would be seen as disassociation, even though the person doesn't actually want to leave. So I believe one of them is taking a blood donation, would be seen as dissociating themselves, even though if they still want to stay. And you can read more about that. The book is called The Shepherd, the Flock of God, and it's available online. So it's something you can read, which is really explains your policy and the process, if that's something you're interested in. So here I just wanted to put a couple of quotes that are specifically from the Watchtower, so Watchtower Awake magazines, which are the magazines that are being published by the Watchtower by Jehovah's Witnesses, and just for you to get a sense of what excommunication or shunning means. And I'm going to read them out, but I'm just going to read the bits I put in bold, so I'm not taking up too much time with it. So it says here, however, you're also showing that you love the wrongdoer enough to do what is best for him or her. Your loyalty to Jehovah may increase the likelihood that the disciplined one will repent and return to Jehovah. So this is one of the reasons why I actually call it the loving provision. It's something that the Jehovah's Witnesses call it. They think that by shunning someone, you're showing them love, because by punishing someone so harshly, they might come back because they want that social connection. So it's, in a way, it's they think it's loving to treat someone this way, because they might repent and return to Jehovah. And the next one says, so just a bold part says, he's not welcome in our midst. We avoid him. Such an individual has no place in the clean organization or congregation of God. He should go back to the wicked group that he once came from and die with that wicked group, with Satan's organization. So this, again, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go too much into detail about cults and how they work, but virtually all cults create this dichotomy, this division between us versus them. And so anyone who's in their group is a good person, whereas everyone outside is evil. And so by instilling that fear, people are very fearful to leave, especially if they've grown up and they don't really know anything outside, because it's that representation. Anything outside is represented as evil. So that's what is my kind of the wicked group of Satan's organization. And the next one asked about what do the parents do? So what should parents do whose children are shunned? It says, will they obey Jehovah's clear direction? And then it says, how would Jehovah feel, though, if the parents of an unrepentant wrongdoer kept putting him to the test by having unnecessary association with their disfellowshipped son or daughter? So I think this is very blaming and very, I think, reading it, it's very much making people feel guilty who would go against the shunning policy. It also, just to give a background as well, again, if there is slight difference if the child is a minor. So if the child is a minor, the minor would still be able to stay within the home, but they would separate certain activities, and it's mainly that the parents would be required to look after the after the kind of physical needs of that child, but it would be there would be the kind of different areas would be divided. For example, one of the people that I interviewed, he spoke about not being able to allow to eat at the same table or eating at a different time, or if anyone in the room, like if the family were discussing anything spiritual, he would be asked to leave the room. So it was very much kind of he very much knew that he was not welcome at the time. And the last one here says, when the bad becomes so ingrained that it's an inseparable part of his makeup, then in order to hate what is bad, a Christian must hate the person with whom the badness is inseparably linked. So this is just to give you a little bit of an insight into how the organization thinks, and the material that the organization puts out to its members, and how they instruct members to think and behave and also feel. So it's very much, if you're familiar with the BITE model by Stephen Hassan, I think this kind of nicely sums up all those elements in those quotes. So before I'll share the research results with you, I'll just really briefly talk about the methodology that I've used. So I've used a kind of mixed method. I've used interpretive phenomenological analysis and narrative research. And the research question that I have used was, how do former Jehovah's Witnesses experience shunning practices? And I looked at people who are born in or raised as Jehovah's Witnesses. If interpretive phenomenological analysis, or it's often shortened to IPA, is a methodology for studying lived experience and meaning making. So it's really looking at how do people experience this phenomena, and how do they make sense of it? How do they understand it? How do they explain it to themselves or to other people? And this methodology comes from psychology, and it's particularly associated with health psychology, but it's now applied to a lot of different fields, including the social sciences. And this research methodology is looking at the lived experience, the Lebenswelt, or the life world. So it's about interpretation. So we very much look at how people interpret things, and it's not so much about we're not about objective facts. We're really looking at how do people experience things. And it's important to bear in mind, and this is a limitation as well of this methodology, IPA looks at the interpretation of the person, but then that gets interpreted by the researcher. So you have a double interpretation, if you like. And it's important as a researcher to bracket, so it's called putting aside your own assumptions and biases, so that you can really focus on the person and you're not influencing the results. And one of the ways that this is done is for providing extracts. So as I will go through the presentation and the research findings, I will actually include quotes from the participants, so that you can really hear it in their own words. And this will also enable you to actually see whether you agree with me or you don't. So maybe you read it a different way and you have a different interpretation, and that's completely fine. That's why it's important that we share these extracts, because they provide transparency. IPA works with very small sample sizes, and in this specific study, I've interviewed 6 people. I've conducted 2 interviews per person, so in total it was 12 interviews. And the reason why we keep it very small is because these interviews sometimes take very, very long. So I had one interview, the longest interview I've had was 6 hours. So I spent almost a full day with that person. And you know, they basically told me their life story, because I combined it with narrative analysis and narrative research. And so I gave participants the opportunity to share whatever they felt to share, like their kind of biography. So these interviews can take really long. So that's why why sample sizes are kept smaller, and so that we can get really depth and rich data. And it's particularly useful for testing theory in practice. So it doesn't really lend itself to theory testing, but we can use theory and then see how that theory actually works in practice. And that works quite well, so we can formulate new hypotheses from there. So I combined this with life history interviews, which is a narrative framework, to understand how the individual shunning experience was embedded in the participants' larger experience within the religious group. As I mentioned before, how shunning is experienced there can be individual differences based on things like age, gender, whether they have mental health issues, also on things like, you know, how as the person had a life before they were a part of this group. Again, in this research they didn't, but that can have an impact. So it was really important for me to understand their experience, because some of the people I interviewed were from what is called mixed households. So one of their parents was a Jehovah's Witness and the other parent wasn't. And I think that also shows that there can be individual differences in that way. So both research methodologies have respect for individual differences and acknowledge that we all experience things slightly differently. The research findings are a snapshot of things, and they shouldn't be taken as absolute truths. So for people affected by shunning, they can perhaps act as an anchor point or catalyst for reflection. So I want to make this really clear as we go through the research findings, because I've had people who read my research, and some people who, you know, reached out to me to said, oh, you know, I don't agree with this point because that's not what I experienced. Or some people who said, you know, oh, this point, you know, this really resonates with me and that's what I experienced. And so as we go through it, there may be things where you say, you know, that's not relevant for me, or this is not what I experienced. And that doesn't, because your experience differ from the research findings, doesn't mean that the research findings necessarily are wrong or that your experience is wrong. It just means that we all experience things very differently. And this is a very small sample size, so 6 is very, very small, and we cannot make generalizations from it. So as we go through, please don't feel like you have to experience those things that I'm mentioning. And, you know, it might be really useful for you to hear something and think, you know, I've not experienced this, this doesn't feel relevant for me, and to reflect on, you know, why does it not feel relevant for me. So it can really, I think, if you do have personal experience, I think it's just maybe an anchor point or a catalyst for reflection. I think that's what I would take it as. And again, it's a snapshot. I think this is a very dynamic area, and we've seen so many changes, especially with the Australian Royal Commission, with the independent inquiry here in England and Wales. And so over time, the policies of the groups might change, how people experience it, because they have connection to other people. might change how people feel about it. So some of the people I interviewed, they were shunned at a time when the internet wasn't really around and people didn't really have access to the internet. So they felt that they were the only people experiencing this, and it wasn't until much later that online support groups started. So those people have a very different experience than someone who perhaps came into being an extra W and had that support available. So just something to bear in mind. So here's just, again, it's just limitations of the study. So small sample size, the results cannot be generalized. With IPA, the research is interpreting. So there are some of the assumptions and biases that I have had that could influence the result. And my aim was to bracket those assumptions or biases. So what I did during my research is I kept a diary, and I often reflected when I heard something or I made an assumption. I tried to reflect it and where that came from, so that I could first of all understand myself better, but also that next time I did another interview, I knew that I wasn't going to steer the interview in a direction or that I was interpreting or making quick judgments about something. The recruitment of participants was done online by a peer support group, and so that might have had an impact on the results, because there may be something about the nature of the peer support group or how it's set up, or the type of people who join an online support group that are different from other people that are not in that group. So so this is just shared here for transparency. So for personal use, as we go through it, as I mentioned, I think it could be really helpful if you have personal experience to ask yourself, which parts of this resonate with me and which parts don't resonate with me. So here's just a brief overview of what I'll talk about in terms of research findings. So first I'll talk about disfellowshipping and what led up to the official announcement. So then when I say official announcement, I mean when the congregation meeting, when the congregation was informed that this person was no longer known as a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And so that is the same, that would be the same as the stage 1, which is the reflexive response state. And then the next one is when the ostracism starts. So this would coincide kind of with the official announcement, which is stage 1 and stage 2. And then adjustment to life outside, I kind of related that to stage 2 and stage 3, which we've seen in the model that I've discussed in the beginning. And then I've put the last one, which is transformation to something positive. And I'm calling this, is this a new ostracism stage? Because it's something that's not mentioned in the ostracism model, but it's something that is mentioned in the grief model by Kübler-Ross. And there's actually a 6th stage with Kessler has, he was working with Kübler-Ross, and he wrote a book called Finding Meaning. And I actually came across a grief model a few months ago, probably a year ago. So this was after I had already finished my dissertation, but I think it would have been something that would have been really helpful at the time. And I think it's still helpful because I can use that and reflect on that now. So I'll go through that now. So the disfellowship process is the very kind of first thing I look at. And what I've found in research, and so what you see here in the quotation marks and with the names, that is what the participants have said. So that's their quotes. The names, as with research, they have been changed, so they're not the real names of the participants. So one of the things I found is that there was a cultural awareness, and in some cases an anticipation of disfellowshipping and shunning. So I'm calling it here institutional shunning. And I put in brackets anticipatory grief, which is a term that is used in grief studies. And I think this is really interesting because when you, and I think this very much shows the difference between institutional shunning and the type of shunning or ostracism we might experience in an everyday situation. So if I just make the example of me and my husband have an argument and he stops talking to me, then there's this very defined moment where the ostracism all of a sudden happens, and it's not something that I could have predicted. It's not something that I knew weeks in advance that on that day he's going to start doing that to me. Whereas in an institutional setting, people will be aware of kind of the rules, either official rules or the unofficial rules that are kind of between the lines. And so that cultural awareness means that when people in a group know that they've broken a rule, they may experience anticipatory grief, and they may anticipate potentially shunning even when it has not happened yet. And so I think this is part of what doesn't work really well with the original ostracism model, because in the original ostracism model, the reflexive stage coincides with the actual shunning, whereas here, the cultural awareness might mean that someone knows in advance of being shunned that they could be shunned, and they may experience negative emotions. So in the quotes, I put, even though I knew that any bad behavior was forbidden by the church. And the next was, I felt so much shame. I knew it was wrong. I could get disfellowshipped. So this really makes it clear that I could get disfellowshipped. So she wasn't disfellowshipped at that point, but she knew I had done something that, according to the group, was wrong. So not saying it's generally wrong. I'm just, according to the group rules, it was wrong. And so I could get disfellowshipped. So there is this awareness of, this is not an okay behavior. I could get disfellowshipped. And there may be also this, she's saying, I felt so much shame. So there is this negative effect that comes with that, with knowing now of that cultural awareness, even though the shunning hasn't happened, and there wasn't a judicial committee at that stage, and nobody else knew except her what had happened. And then I then looked at the judicial committee, and I'm defining it as kind of a liminal stage. So I think it's pre-reflexive, so it's in the sense that the shunning hasn't actually happened yet, but it is that process of knowing that the outcome could be disfellowshipping. And the person said it was really horrible, really, really horrible, intrusive questions with no reason for it. And depends on the person, depends on the money and the position. Not everyone is treated the same. It all depends on the elders within the congregation. Mentally, you're a slave to those people. That little group that's going to decide about you, if you're going to suffer or if you're pardoned. And that's probably the most where my anger comes from. It's like in medieval times, few people deciding about your future. So it's really that liminal space where people don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, it could go either way. We see here, it depends on the money, the position that the person has. Not everyone is treated the same, but almost I feel there's a little bit of sense of like almost like a lottery in a sense. And it's that liminal stage where we don't know what's going to happen. The person doesn't know what's going to happen yet. And then the next stage was in those situations, because everyone that I interviewed was disfellowshipped and excommunicated. So for all of them, the next stage was the announcement, which is the formal statement for the congregation. And so it was one of the really interesting points here is that, and this is not something I've mentioned in the dissertation, because it's something that I actually recognized much later on. And it's interesting that some people chose to go to the announcement. So some people were in the room when it was announced. Some were there because they couldn't control it. So, for example, they were living with their parents, and their parents just took them along to the meeting. But some people went there, and they were adults, so they could have chosen not to go to the announcement. But because, as we've seen, ostracism affects control to a degree. And so I think there could be a sense that going to the congregation is a way that people felt the control, and it kind of felt more real. It's almost like they couldn't believe it if they didn't hear it. So there was a sense of perhaps in some way there was a small amount of control going and knowing it, or that it was going to be announced. And so I'm just reading out the quote here. So it says, usually they're all disappeared. Somebody got disfellowshipped and they just left, and you never saw them again. But it was different with me. I was too young, so I couldn't leave. So because I was only a kid and I wasn't allowed to leave home until I was 16, my stepdad said, you're still under my roof, so you still have to go to the Kingdom Hall. So even on the night that it was announced, I was there. And this is interesting because it sounds like he perhaps wouldn't have been there if he had a choice. And so he was there involuntarily and heard the announcement. And Isabel says, I went the night it was announced that I was disfellowshipped, which I don't think many people had actually gone to that. So I went along, which was quite harsh, because you go from walking in when everybody's a friend to walking away from it, thinking that's the end of it. And so this here, again, as I mentioned before, I think shunning can exist on that spectrum where, you know, you're being shunned within your house, maybe by a partner, and so they're still around you, but they're just not talking to you. But it can also go to shunning being a complete physical absence, and that is most often what it would be in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses. And it would generally be often the case within cults, because if you have someone there, they could be seen as having a negative influence, or the cult would see it as having a potential negative influence, and putting the group into danger, having someone there who's not part of the group. So the next one is about the ostracism itself. And so people spoke about what it was actually like being ostracized. And so Philip talks about ostracism feels like school was your whole life. And I think this is a really, really, really relevant quote, because a lot of us will actually be able to relate to this in a small way. So he says, we can all associate with someone getting bullied at school. So imagine school is your whole life and you can't go home. And everybody in that school, the teachers, fellow pupil, everybody's against you. That's what it's like. So I'm really, if you can hear my voice, I mean, it does, I mean, even now, you know, reading this after, and I've read these quotes many times, they really still hit me. And it's something that a lot of us, as I said, will be able to relate to. And so ostracism is like that, especially in groups where it is institutionalized, there's rules around it, it's something you can't get away from. And again, just to bear in mind, Philip is the person that was shunned when he was a minor, so he couldn't leave, so he was still kind of exposed to the environment. The next thing that people talked about was the impact on self versus impact on family and friends. And so I had someone who was still living at home at the time that he was disfellowshipped, but because he was an adult, so he could leave, and initially he was still living with his parents, but because his parents started to be kind of shunned by proxy, so people would avoid coming around to his family's home, he decided that he would leave and he would move away, so that his parents wouldn't be treated the same as him, and people wouldn't avoid the house. The next thing is about various levels of control. So again, it's this really very much speaks to interpersonal differences, because not everyone will experience shunning in the same way, either because obviously there's interpersonal differences, so I might experience it in a completely different way than someone else, but also it might be different because not everyone is shunned the same way, or not everyone interprets shunning the same way. So here we have, the first one talks about children and young people. So children and young people might feel a different level of control because they can't leave that environment. So he says, I was too young, so I couldn't leave. I wanted to leave, but my only choice was to run away from home. That was it. So he talked about, he had this plan of running away from home as a teenager. And then Ursula talks about, it was like psychologically, it was unbearable. And my parents communicated with me that it's their house and they behave as JWs, and that it was my decision to leave JW. So therefore, I had to carry on with the consequences of it. So I'm not sure if I'd say it was my decision. I was forced to it. Yeah, I was forced to move out. So she talks about having to move out, feeling like she had to move out because she wasn't able to cope living in the same environment. And then the next part speaks about people having different interpretations of what shunning means. So some people actually interpret it as a test, as a desire to, they had a desire to return, to thought this was just going to be one really difficult test. So Isabel says, so don't think it left me with that finality of like, that's it, I've left. It was almost like this is just all a big test to see how strong I am. So when she talks about finality, she attended the announcement, and she thought that it might mean that it's over and she's out of the group, but she had this kind of interpretation of this is just a big test, and if I'm strong enough, then eventually the congregation will say there was a mistake. Shunning practice and individual family differences. So some of the people I've interviewed, they shared that they had family members that secretly still met up with them and that secretly had contact, and there were secret phone calls and things. So even though the rules were very clear, not everyone might experience it in the same way, because not everyone necessarily might follow the same rules. And so there might also be interpretations of what it means, as we've seen before. There's the word unnecessary association. So people might kind of play with that meaning of that. So yeah, so that's another bit. So adjusting to life outside. I've put quite a lot on that slide, so I hope it can still be read. So what the narratives of this stage cover is the reflective stage. So this is really kind of the coping stage of how people dealt with the shunning and how they adjusted to it. So one of them was me, others, and the world. And this was a really strong theme for everyone that I've researched. Because as I mentioned before, there is this dichotomy between everyone inside is good, everyone outside is evil. And so there was fear for a lot of people of what it means to no longer be part of the group, but not feeling part of the world either, because that's something that Jehovah's Witnesses don't want to be part of the world. So it's this kind of being in this limbo space. And also, especially for people who are born into these groups, they don't have a reference point for what life outside is like. And so it can be really difficult for them to navigate social customs and know how to behave when they're not in that group. And so I'm just going to read some of the quotes to give you a sense of what it was like for the people I've interviewed. So Michael says, I remember just sitting in my company car on the edge of the road thinking, what's the point? Why am I staying alive, you know? This is dreadful. I don't know anybody, and I don't understand how the world works. So here we have this thing of this theme of not knowing how the world works, how the world outside of the group works. And then Christina says, you're so different to anybody on the rest of the planet, you know? You haven't much in common with any other people. You don't find it easy to make friends because you got nothing to talk about. You haven't grown up with the usual things like having birthdays, Christmas, things like that. You know, your values are all different, your beliefs are all different, so you don't gel with people very much. So there's this sense again of like values being very different, customs, traditions, not having experience and not being sure how to behave. Someone spoke about not knowing what to give someone to a birthday, you know, what is an appropriate gift. So it's all these things that, you know, we do very automatically, we don't think about them. But other people, people who leave these environments, it's these questions that they have, very practical questions that we just take for granted, really. The other major theme for people who had been shunned, were adjusting to life, was fears, and they were often doctrine-based fears. So they were told that, you know, if they left, they would die at Armageddon. The outside world is evil, and so lots of bad things will happen to them. And so Michael here talks about his fear of Armageddon. And he says, the next few years, I still had the old Armageddon panic. Tom Robinson had a song in the mid-'80s called War Baby. And there's a line in there where he says, my friends talk and joke and laugh about Armageddon, but like a nightmare, it's still waiting there at the end of each and every day. And that was pretty much it, you know. It's the fear. It took about 5 years to stop, and about 10 years to disappear completely. So here we see that these fears, they can stay with people for a really, really long period of time. And they can really wear people down, especially if it impacts sleep, if it impacts everyday functioning. And then Philip says, I suppose even though I've never been a fearful person, there was a bit of fear in there, if I'm honest, fear of the unknown, because all I knew was that, so everything that was out with that was unknown, and the fear of the unknown is the biggest fear that you can have. Once you gain the knowledge, you lose the fear. And I think he speaks to two really important things here. So fear of the unknown, but also once you gain knowledge, you lose the fear. And one of the things, and we'll see that in the coping mechanism section, is that knowledge, so psychoeducation about what's happening, what's going on, and being able to make sense of it, that's a really, really big part for people to be able to cope with it and to lose that fear and to feel like they're starting to fit in and making sense of their lives. So the next section, I'm going to keep it very brief. I know that, you know, I'll probably speak an hour about each of those things, but I want to keep it to a manageable chunk of time. So the coping mechanisms that people used that I've interviewed, they spoke about drugs and other forms of addiction. So obviously these would be what we might call unhealthy coping mechanisms. They were working towards reinstatement. So for some people, they saw it as a test, and so because they thought they were going to be reinstated anyway, the adjustment to the world outside wasn't really something that was really going on for them so much at that time. Personal independence was a coping mechanism for a lot of people. This could be either, so some people had personal independence of want to be a very independent person, not being controlled, but at the extreme end, people didn't want to enter new relationships anymore because they were fearful of being shunned again. Professional therapy. So I've put some on the side that are more positive, and on the other side are the ones that we might see as unhealthy coping mechanisms. The healthy ones we might look at as professional therapy, informal peer support, and psychoeducation or education. So some people talked about even just going to university and doing any kind of course was really positive because they felt that they were learning, and that was something that they weren't allowed to do when they were part of the group. They were only allowed to consume material that was produced by the group. And with new relationship with religion and spirituality, so some people eventually joined another church, another group. Other people completely lost connection with any religious or spirituality, and they would describe themselves as atheists. And the last point here that everyone spoke about is forgiveness. And I think forgiveness is something that actually some people have reached out to me and they felt that they shouldn't have to forgive anyone. And I think this is a very personal, forgiveness is very, very personal. And I just want to, again, share that some of the people that I've interviewed, they have been out for many years, sometimes decades. And so I think forgiveness for those people was a very long journey and process. It's not something that happened from one day to the next. What they spoke about in terms of forgiveness was that what helped them was having an understanding of what happened to their parents. So, for example, understanding that their parents were struggling and that they were seeking something and the thought that they found something that was really good for them. As well as understanding coercive control. So some people actually came to view their own parents as victims of coercive control, and that allowed them to forgive them. So the next part, and this is the last part of the research findings, is the transformation into something positive. So this one is really interesting, and I think it goes in some ways against that, against the original ostracism model, because everyone who I interviewed, they're still shunned. They continue to be shunned as far, obviously this was research in 2017. So in 2017, at that moment, they were still shunned. They had been shunned for some had been shunned for decades. Some, had children and their children were being shunned. So it was something that was still going on for them. So they haven't re-entered those relationships, and they were still experiencing shunning, and they were still experiencing the pain from shunning as well. So it's not something that goes away. It's something that stays with them and that stayed with them. But it's something that they use to really transform and get something positive out of it for themselves and for other people. So I kind of look at this as being very similar to the acceptance and meaning stage that Kübler-Ross and Kessler are talking about. And so the meaning stage, just to mention it, it's relatively new, and this was a book that came out in 2019 called Finding Meaning, the Sixth Stage of Grief. So if anyone is interested in that, it's something that you may wish to go away and read. Just to share as well, the model is called the stages of grief, and it's sometimes been criticized because stages sounds like it's one stage after the next, and it's almost like a roadmap. Whereas the authors, so Kübler-Ross and Kessler, have themselves spoken about that it's not a sequential process, and you can go from one stage to the next. And it's more a sense of experiencing an emotion or experiencing a stage that can then be followed up at any other stage. And I think the way I think shunning happens and these stages happen is that they can bounce back and forth. So for example, major life events can actually trigger stages that are come before transformation to something positive. So for example, someone who perhaps if they have a child who is still in a child or a family member that is still within the group, and that person says, say they're getting married and they're not invited to that wedding, or perhaps they're invited to that wedding, but they're asked to not interact with anyone and nobody's interacting with them, that might re-trigger some of those experiences, some of those negative experiences of being really actively shunned, even though they may, in their everyday life, they may not really be spending every day thinking about it. So it's really a major life event, I think, can kind of re-trigger things. And so they're not neatly consequential. So after transformation into something positive, it doesn't mean it's not going to hurt anymore or everything is going to be great. It just means that I do think, from speaking to so many people, there is something that people are taking away and making something positive out of it. And so I've just put here 2 quotes. And also Philip says, "It made me contemplate, learn and understand what it's like to be alone, to become comfortable with myself. It made me strong-willed. It made me very, very independent. Being shunned has made me acutely aware of the effect of how we treat other people, particularly as groups, and I have from that day to this, at my own risk, defended the undefended. I swore back then, if I knew someone who needed a hand and wasn't getting a hand, and I could see it, then I would do it." Then Isabel says, "I'm a big believer in things happen for a reason. When I look at it, I can still remember for quite a number of years afterwards, thinking, do you know what? If that hadn't happened, I'd still be in there now. And to me, that is more horrific." So I haven't specifically gone into very much detail about the peer support, but a lot of people, and I think that also falls into transformation to something positive, most of the people that I've interviewed, they're part of peer support groups, and some of them are admins, or they're running those peer support groups, and so they're really using that experience to help other people who are recently, coming out of the group or being shunned, or they might be in the group and receive support themselves. So it is something that people use that experience to want to have an impact for other people and for themselves. There is a risk in terms of peer support, which I haven't mentioned either, but if you're interested, you can read it in the full dissertation. Peer support comes with a kind of a double-edged sword. So some people spoke about having to take breaks from peer support because they felt that they were moving from being a Jehovah's Witness to an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and so they kind of felt like they didn't have a identity outside of that Jehovah's Witness label, whether that is a current or an ex-member. And so some people felt they had to take a step back to just really find out who they are themselves. So it's something just to mention in terms of peer support that I think was a really interesting and important finding. And that is the bulk of kind of my research and the work that came out of it. I hope this was really interesting and it was valuable and you learned something that perhaps can help you or can help someone else. So I'll just share a couple of takeaways. And before I do, one of the things that I've mentioned in the beginning, and I actually wanted to mention it in the very beginning and forgot, and just remembering it now, I think it's really important as well for us as people to not just look at ostracism in terms of how other people treat us, but also how we treat other people. So it's most of us have experienced ostracism of some kind. So whether that is, the silent treatment that we give our partner, or a kind of a timeout that we do with our children, or that that we might have experienced as child. I think it's important to bear in mind that we also do it, and so it's really important to understand how much we're able to harm and hurt people when we use that behavior. And it's really thinking about, I think what's really important for me is thinking about how else can we behave to help us get what it is that we need. How else can we fulfill our needs that doesn't hurt other people? And I think that is perhaps one of the key messages maybe that should come out of this research and really out of those reflections is how can we treat each other with kindness in our everyday relationships. Obviously, it's very different in an institutional setting where someone else demands this of us. But I think it's just something I kind of want to leave you with as well. So the key takeaway, we have seen ostracism hurts, and that there's really strong research base for that. It hurts all of us, or probably most of us anyway. And ostracism is a perversive social phenomenon. So it exists in one-to-one relationships, it exists in groups and organizations. There are similarities in experiences. So a lot of people who are shunned will have similar experiences. As we've seen, there's kind of a common thread of fundamental needs that are harmed or threatened. However, there are many individual differences. So it's important that we not make assumptions about how other people are going to feel or how they should feel or what's the right way to feel about it, because there is no right way. Whatever way we feel about it is okay. And it's true for us. Finding support is really important. So everyone, again, I haven't really gone into the professional therapy angle, but most people that I've interviewed have had some form of professional therapy or peer support, and that was really invaluable. So it was for them, it was very much about, it was the understanding. So what's the psychoeducation? How could this happen? Why did this happen to me? Why did it happen to my parents? Why are they doing this? So what is the reason that ostracism is used? And it was also really important to hear other people that had those experiences through peer support and seeing that other people do make it out. So I have this story. Sometimes I get these emails from people saying, you know, I want to leave, but I don't know how to leave, and what's going to happen after. It's like, you know, am I going to feel really horrible all the time? And so I've used that reason and shared with people. You know, there are people that say that research participants say that they are very glad that even though it has been so painful being shunned, that their life now is so much better than it was before. So I do think based on that there can be positive experiences, and there can be recovery from cultic relationships. And it is common for people to experience the loss associated with ostracism in cycles and waves. So again, this is talking about the major life events being trigger points. Again, this is not really something that I've looked at very specifically in my research. It's something that my thinking has kind of developed on over the years. And so it's something that I'm still kind of working on a little bit at the moment. If you're interested in know more, please feel free to reach out. And I'm very happy to share more. And again, here I've just underlined life after high control groups exit is possible. And I think that's kind of I think it's a really positive, hopefully a really positive message for anyone who's listening and who has had experience or is still experiencing shunning. So the last slide, I just have some references. So these are the references that I refer to throughout the presentation. So if there's anything that you want to read more about, there's some reading material that you can find. And on the very last slide, there are my contact details, so my email, my LinkedIn, and access to my dissertation and paper. If anyone would like to read it, again, it is quite academic and perhaps a bit dry in some stages, but I hope it proves interesting to those who do want to read it. Thank you so much again for listening through this presentation and for listening and for being here. And yeah, I'm very happy to take questions if anyone has questions about the research.